Good evening. My name is Greg Mittman, and on behalf of the Center for the Humanities, I'd like to welcome you to the second of this spring's Humanities Without Boundaries lectures. I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the homelands of the Ho-Chunk people, whose ancestors lived in this region for at least 12,000 years, but who were forcibly removed by our state and federal governments following the Treaty of 1832. And I'd just like to say a few words about the Center for the Humanities and its public-facing mission. The center aims to serve the needs and interests of the UW-Madison campus, the Madison community, and citizens of the state through a wide range of humanities-related programming, events, and professional development opportunities, including our Humanities Without Boundaries lecture series, which features scholars from around the world whose work exemplifies bold practices and ideas at the edge of the humanities. And tonight's speaker, Professor Michelle Murphy, is not only a bold visionary thinker, she is also someone deeply committed to pondering and putting in practice how work in the humanities might, in the spirit of collaboration and good relations, meaningfully transform places and lives. As head of the Technoscience Research Unit and professor of history and gender and women's studies at the University of Toronto, she has built a collective of scholars, students, and activists engaged with questions of technoscience as it relates to environmental and reproductive justice, data politics, chemical exposures, infrastructures, indigenous science and technology studies, race, and colonialism. She is a founding member of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative, which drew international attention and press coverage when they launched a guerrilla archiving project to protect vulnerable environmental data in federal government agencies threatened by political attacks on climate change science in the United States. EDGI, its acronym, has also worked to develop participatory civic technologies and infrastructures to make data and decision-making more accessible and accountable. Professor Murphy is also a prodigious scholar whose work spans the history of science, feminist science studies, and indigenous studies, among other fields. She is the only author to ever have twice won the Ludwig Fleck Prize, the most distinguished book award offered by the Society for the Social Studies of Science, for her first book, Sick Building Syndrome and the Problem of Uncertainty, Environmental Politics, Technoscience, and Women Workers, published by Duke University Press in 2006, and for her latest book, The Economization of Life, also published by Duke in 2017. Her other books include Seizing the Means of Reproduction, Entanglements of Feminism, Health, and Technoscience, and the edited volume, Landscapes of Exposure, Knowledge and Illness in Modern Environments, as well as numerous articles in journals such as Cultural Anthropology, Environmental History, and Catalyst, Feminism, Theory, and Technoscience, where she also served as the lead editor. In almost 2 decades of collaboration and friendship, Michelle has been opening my eyes and many other scholars around the world to new ways of thinking, new possibilities of being, and new worlds of becoming. She is someone whose work will keep scholars busy for decades to come, pondering and exploring the new ideas and new worlds she has cracked open for us all. Professor Murphy's visit to the UW-Madison is also part of the John E. Sawyer Seminar on Interrogating the Plantationist Scene, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. The seminar features a series of public talks, roundtables, workshops, film screenings, and exhibitions that run through April of 2020 and is meant to interrogate the past and present of plantations, the economic, ecological, and political transformations they wrought, and their significance to the making of human bodies, capitalism, and land over the course of 4 centuries. We hope you will join us tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. in this same room, where Professor Murphy will be joined by Jason Moore from SUNY Binghamton and Shona Jackson from Texas A&M in a wide-ranging discussion on the Capitalocene. Tonight's lecture is being generously co-sponsored by the Holt Center for Science and Technology Studies, with additional support from the Anonymous Fund, Brittingham Funds, the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology Program, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, for which we are grateful. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Michelle Murphy.
Thank you so much. Can people in the back hear me okay? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that just humbling introduction. Greg has been a mentor and inspiring colleague of mine for 20 years, so it's a real honor to be here and part of this series, as well as I want to thank Pablo Gomez, Sophie Moore, the Holt Center, and the folks at STS, Amaraltut, Melissa, and the staff at the Center for Humanities, all for helping bring me here today. Am I a little echoey? Is that the room? Does it make it better if I hold it higher? Okay. Okay, how's that? Less echoey? I know, so one of my friends already said, I gotta hold it up. Just have to deal with it. Okay, great. So, my talk today. Well, I imagine if you've come to several of these, you've already been thinking about charismatic concepts like the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene, these versions of thinking about environmental violence that pose problems at a planetary scale, often going back decades, if not centuries. Is this going to work? I got like 20 people instructing me. Okay, how's that? That's better, right? Okay, yes. Already we've had achievement. But I'm going to try to avoid talking about the planetary. And I want to think with you tonight about starting with the place of here, the scale of each other, and the making of decolonial potentials in difference. So doing this kind of decolonial environmental justice work that I do in academia is tricky. And it's tricky because the university has, to a significant extent, been built materially and epistemologically out of the histories and structures which have helped to make environmentally violent worlds. So the university's in part been built by militarism, and it's been built by capitalism and colonialism. And we know the university's been built and funded by things like slavery and extraction. So the concepts that academics have inherited are often the creatures of the very structures we might wish to end. So a decolonial approach to environmental violence is necessarily about ending colonialism. So how to know where to start, like that's big. Or put another way, how to know where to depart. How to carefully but urgently stop doing some things, to get rid of some concepts, to break some habits, and to make room for something else. Make room for what Fanon called bringing invention into existence. Make room for other ways of being and doing. How to stop reproducing the concepts and the practices that prop up environmental violence, and instead activate what is already here, what persists, all the ways communities already know how to do and be less violently together. And particularly, I'm thinking about Indigenous, Black, queer, and migrant communities who know well how to live in hostile conditions. So with the theme of the plantation, or interrogating the plantation, I want to begin tonight with what I learned about plantation when I started graduate school. And something that Greg didn't mention in his introduction is that I'm Métis from Winnipeg. My mom is Métis from Red River, and my dad is white. I don't know if people here, probably in Wisconsin, know about Métis people, but the Red River Métis are known for taking up armed resistance against the colonial state. So when I arrived in Boston in 1992 from Toronto and being from Winnipeg, I was struck by the thought, where is everybody? Where are all the Indigenous people? I began to research this question. I was studying history. I began to research it as best I could, focusing on the 17th century. And I learned quickly about the horrific loss of life to epidemic illness and the world-breaking repercussions of this loss for communities. I learned about how in the wake of this loss, New England colonists coerced communities to surrender their land. I learned about how the Puritans, in their quest to create a theocracy, built these things called praying towns, or otherwise known as praying plantations, where Nipmuc, Wampanoag, and Massachusetts people were pressured to live and be converted into proper Christians with property and patriarchal monogamy as strict rules, and with an emphasis on education through the Bible. I learned how the praying towns were the precursors to reserves, how they turned into prisons, and they particularly turned into prisons when the colonists passed a law that an Indigenous person could be killed on sight if they left the praying town. I learned about the genocidal King Philip's War of 1675, in which the most faithful praying Indians were put in shackles and incarcerated on what is Deer Island, which is part of Boston now, and how many people fled. So I start here because in English, one of the earliest meanings of plantation was the act of establishing a colony. To do a plantation was to establish a colony via settlement and agriculture, thereby bringing land into productivity and Christian governance. Thus, I want to think with you tonight about what we might call settler colonial plantation. Here we can see the structure of settler colonial plantation in the official seal of the Company of Massachusetts Bay, established through royal charter by the British Crown. The Company of the Massachusetts Bay was one of the founding companies that began plantation here in what we now call the United States. British colonialism then was to a large extent achieved by the formation of these companies, who were granted entitlement not to just trade in a particular region, like the East Indian Company, for example, but also to plant, to settle, and to rule that land. We see in this seal the figure of an Indigenous person who is saying in Latin, "Come over and help us," authorizing the company as a Christian missionizing project, meant to convert Indigenous people into the proper way of life. We see the plants themselves signaling the entitlement to take land and replace Indigenous life by virtue of properly productive plant relations. So in starting with colonial plantation, I want you to notice this tight coupling of the company, the corporation, and colonialism. Canada, too, was started by a colonial company. Like the Company of Massachusetts Bay, the Hudson's Bay Company was granted a charter in 1670, but for an even greater area, what was called Rupert's Land, which extended all the way across the continent, as far as really the adventurers in London could imagine. Reading the charter, one finds again the language and logic of plantation as a name for what we now call settler colonialism. As part of that plantation, the Hudson's Bay Company was not particularly concerned with establishing agriculture, but instead making the land productive by establishing a vast network of extractive trading. Rather than oil or minerals, extraction in the 17th through 19th century largely concerned animal furs and timber, beavers and trees. Here we find settler colonial plantation turning animals, plants, and people into resources which can be killed by and for the profit of the company. In 1870, the Hudson's Bay is sold to the Dominion of Canada. The company turned into the nation state. That, if we look at the map, That's the Hudson's Bay Company, gets sold into Canada. The company turns into the nation state. The extractive company becomes Canada. The seizing of lands where other people lived in worlds of their own determination by the Hudson's Bay Company and the Company of Massachusetts Bay were undergirded by a framework which is called the Doctrine of Discovery, a 15th century theology of European governance that rested on two important legal frames. First, the frame of terra nullius, the legal fiction that land is empty. It's empty unless it takes the form of a colonial property. Anything can be done to empty land in the name of colonial productivity. The second aspect of the law is the entitlement of European governments to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue, to kill, hurt, and enslave any non-Christian without it being called a form of violence. This entitlement is rooted in the European Crusades and became then translated into the right of indigenous elimination, as well as the right to slavery, which was then passed on to the colonial company and then on to the nation state. Thus, as scholars of settler colonialism have shown, settler colonial plantation sets up a crucial trilogy of positions for understanding environmental violence in the United States and Canada today. We have the planter settler, represented through the figure of the corporation, rooted in a sense of supremacy, rooted in whiteness, who is entitled to organize a world through property and violence. Then we have the figure of the indigenous, who was erased in terra nullius and subject to elimination and replacement for the sake of the planter's world. And then we have the figure of the slave, rooted in anti-Black racism, who can be owned and fully opened to violence, and whose labor and life is stolen for the sake of agricultural productivity, which then gives rise to the US system of racial capitalism. So why have I started with this long kind of academic discussion of settler colonial plantation? And what does it have to do with chemicals and pollution? So beginning with settler colonial plantation, I think asks us to notice three things I want you to keep in mind tonight. The first is that it asks us to attend to land and the specificity of place when we're grappling with environmental violence. Second, it asks us to call into question the sense that environmental violence can be adequately understood as a future-oriented problem of impending apocalypse, whether it be the Anthropocene or dominant ways of talking about climate change. For whom is massive world-breaking violence on the horizon, and for whom has it been ongoing? Third, and lastly, I want to ask you to think about this call to entitlement, the entitlement to perpetuate violence that is not called violence, to kill that is not called killing, to destroy that is not called destruction. So I want us to be thinking about these three things. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time thinking about settler colonial plantation and talking to you about Canada's Chemical Valley. Pollution in Chemical Valley is also the story of corporations and colonialism that together make possible a violence that is not counted as such. And I want to turn to one of the questions I started with. What if many of our concepts for understanding environmental violence are wrong? What if they were built by the very systems we need to undo? What if they were built by settler colonialism? What if they are part of the erasure of violence? Therefore, what I want to ask is, what is chemical pollution? What is a chemical? What to do if the chemical, as given to us by chemistry and industry, was built in such a way as it primarily helps to accomplish environmental violence? I'm going to tell you. What if our dominant version of the chemical is part of settler colonialism? I think we need to refuse the chemical, at least this version of the chemical I'm going to be talking about, and then ask ourselves, what alternate sense of the chemical might we create? What might another sense of a chemical look like if we saw it in its full relations and obligations, if we made chemicals in a way that affirmed Indigenous sovereignty, if we understood chemicals in a way that responsibilized perpetrators of pollution, if we understood chemicals in a way that refused to treat land as a resource. So the work that we're doing on Chemical Valley is part of the lab that Greg mentioned, the Environmental Data Justice Lab. And this is our lab, folks, and we're Indigenous-led, Indigenous majority lab at the Technoscience Research Unit doing a project called Visualizing Colonial Violence. And we think of what we're doing as part of Indigenous science and technology studies. And what I mean by that is that, if we think about the relationship between science and Indigenous people, it's mostly science studying Indigenous people or extracting information from Indigenous people. But Indigenous science actually turns the tables on that. It's Indigenous people studying how science works. And so our lab is a group of Indigenous, Black, and people of color members who are studying how settler colonial science works and how we might remake it through the values that we care about. And so trying to do this in a university lab has to start with figuring out all these things, like all our values. What does a decolonial lab look like? What are our obligations? What are our relations? What are we doing? Who are we doing it for? So Chemical Valley. Chemical Valley is on the St. Clair River, which goes between Lake Huron and Lake Erie. It flows south. So it's part of the lower Great Lakes. And Chemical Valley is an area in Canada where there's some 47 petrochemical facilities that process 40% of Canada's petrochemicals. It's the petrochemical refining center of Canada. And while I know here in the US, you all are struggling with deregulation of industry and deregulation of polluters, Chemical Valley is a real testament to how long petrochemical refineries have been unregulated in Canada. So for example, the refineries in Chemical Valley produce 10 times the amount of benzene that's a baseline for here in Canada. On some pollutants, they produce 50 to 60 times as much as a comparable US facility. The 14 oil refineries in Canada create more emissions than the 127 refineries in the US combined. So this is a place of intensive pollution. And it's located on the lower Great Lakes. It's located on this incredibly important body of water. And I know you here are also on a lake and you're connected to the Great Lakes and you're aware that this is an area that holds something like 21% of the world's fresh surface water, over 80% of North America's fresh surface water, that this water not only support life, but is its own form of life that we're in obligation to. We cannot live without this water. And so Chemical Valley is on this particular piece of the Great Lakes. And on one side is Chemical Valley, which is on Canada, and on the other side is Michigan. If you flow downwards, you end up in Detroit. The important thing, though, that I want to point out here is that Chemical Valley is on Anishinaabe territory. Chemical Valley is on the territory of Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And Aamjiwnaang's First Nation territory stretched on both sides of the river to what is now Michigan, Ontario on this side, a big area of land. It was part of the Three Fires Confederacy. And in 1827, the Canadian side of that land was sold off in something called the Huron Tract Purchase. And Aamjiwnaang First Nation and that community of people were split into 4 different small reserves. One reserve which is now entirely surrounded by Chemical Valley. And so once the Huron Purchase happened, and here I just want to point out what the Crown did, was the Crown did the purchase. They immediately formed a company called the Canadian Company, the Canada Company, to sell off. So again, we have the company in colonialism. As soon as settlers started to arrive, they started to learn about these beds where oil would just bubble up from the ground, these oil beds that were well known. speculators started to come, oil speculators. Well, it's hard to call them oil speculators, land speculators at this time. And this is the site of the world's first commercial oil field. It beats like Pennsylvania by like just a couple of months. And quickly we have land speculators coming, setting up these oil wells. Oil wells at the time were very simple. They would just, if they had a gusher, they would just spray the oil up into the air. The trees would be covered with oil. The creeks would be covered with oil. We have descriptions in the archives of the St. Clair River being covered with an inch of oil all the way down to the lake. And after we have the oil, we have the beginning of the refineries. So this is the site of some of the world's oldest refineries. And in fact, we are studying one particular refinery, which is the Imperial Oil Refinery, which we believe is the world's oldest refinery, started in 1870. And so this is it in 1897. And so while this is happening in the area of Chemical Valley, where kind of fossil fuel capitalism is beginning to be invented, if we go a little bit farther south down the river, we're in Detroit. And we get the invention of Fordism. We get the site of industrialism in the automobile. We get the invention of new kinds of industrialized racial capitalism. So all this is happening on the same stretch of river. So this place on the Great Lakes is a really important hub for the history of the development of fossil fuel capitalism. But what I want to remind us of is that it wouldn't have been possible without indigenous elimination. And we see the shadow of indigenous elimination even in Detroit, right, in the name of all the cars that they produced. So by World War II, Chemical Valley was part of a national war project. They started building it out. They not only had oil refineries, they were figuring out what are the other things you can do with oil, like make plastics, make polymers, right? And this is Chemical Valley on the Canadian $10 bill. So you get a sense of its national importance. And as the second half of the 20th century went on, this refinery kept expanding and expanding. And all that waste that they used to kind of throw in the water or spray up onto the trees gets captured in separate lines and turned into an abundance of plastics, styrenes, all sorts of the chemical products of petrochemical capitalism. So this is kind of what the refinery looks like now. The oil is fractionated into many, many different lines. And then these lines go all across Chemical Valley into many different facilities to make all the plastics and fuels and lubricants and so on that come to make the good life of Madison, Wisconsin. The kind of example. We have to remember, though, that this whole process of making fossil fuel capitalism here was only possible because of an ongoing project of land seizure, an ongoing project of trying to get Aamjiwnaang land and turn it into property that could be sold. And in paying attention to that, we also have to pay attention to the fact that there was ongoing resistance to the selling of that land. There was ongoing resistance to the claiming of the subterranean rights to oil and so on, and as well as the water, etc., still to this day. So Chemical Valley is since 1850. Right? It's over 150 years of chemical pollution. It's one of the places where they've been doing petrochemical pollution the longest. So it's sedimented into the place. And in the lower Great Lakes, one of the ways it really shows is that this is a place where reproductive changes in organisms, and particularly effects that are caused by the effects of chemicals to endocrine systems, are pervasive across animals. You find them in fish, turtles, birds, mammals, as well as humans. In Aamjiwnaang researchers have shown that their birth rate has half as many boys as should be expected. Right? Their sex ratio has changed from living in the shadow of Chemical Valley. This area is so kind of part of this history of chemicals that the chickadees and the house sparrows actually sing a different song that they sing because they've developed in the presence of the chemicals that came from this period of industrialization. So I tell you this to help me begin thinking more about this question of what if the dominant ways of understanding chemical pollution were built to allow this history of violence, not stop it. I can look at 150 years of Chemical Valley and the pollution has not stopped. So what we're trying to think about in the lab is how to refuse the normative idea of the chemical that we use to understand chemical pollution and make room for other kinds of decolonial relations. So I want to go through with you 3 ways of unthinking chemicals, 3 habits of the settler colonial approach to chemical violence. The first is gaslighting, the second is damage-based research, and the third is making chemicals small and individual. So this is February 23rd, 2017. That's the Imperial Oil refinery. This is taken on a smartphone from the US side of the river. What are we watching here? Right? What are we looking at? Well, this is what Imperial Oil said. It was a small grass fire. It was put out. There was no air monitoring results to report, and there were no injuries. So I think probably everyone in this room is familiar with this kind of corporate spin doctoring, right? This kind of doublespeak. We're not so surprised to hear Imperial Oil would say nothing was happening, right? But here I want to show you just the list of spills that happen in Chemical Valley right around that same time. There's pretty well a spill or a leak reported every day. But what we get is about the size of a tweet. What we get is about a size of the tweet. So I've begun to think about this as a kind of gaslighting, right? And how many people here have now heard of gaslighting? Because I think it's become more popular to understand about it in our current political climate, in the age of alternate facts. So gaslighting as an idea came out of thinking by communities of domestic abuse survivors who are trying to understand not just the physical dimensions of abuse, right, but the psychological dimensions of abuse. And gaslighting refers to this movie from 1939 with Ingrid Bergman, which is a great portrayal, or a horrific portrayal, of a husband who's psychologically abusing his wife to not trust her own perception, to not trust her own senses about what is happening, so that she questions her own sanity. So gaslighting names this kind of abuse of manipulating people into doubting their own reality. We know, of course, Teen Vogue declared Donald Trump to be a great gaslighter. In Canada, we might look at Trudeau and his claims to take Indigenous nation-to-nation relations as a first priority while pushing through pipelines without Indigenous consent as a kind of gaslighting. But techniques of gaslighting are often very subtle, right? Sometimes they're blatant lies, but they're often this weird thing of you see it happening, right? You can see it, you can sense it like those flames, but then you get the message, nothing is happening here. Changing the subject, compliments tangled with lies, counter accusations, you're the one lying, you're the one not knowing what to do. Maybe there's lots of people in this room from their workplace or their classrooms recognize these kind of subtle forms of gaslighting where you thought you just said something and then someone else who's maybe like older or whiter or maler says the exact same thing and everyone was like, that was a great idea. You're like, I just said that, right? So that incident at Imperial Oil, Vanessa Gray from our lab, important land protector from Aamjiwnaang First Nation, very fierce land protector, she tried to take Imperial Oil to court for that, to get him criminally charged for that big flare. Unfortunately, we have a current government who's not interested in environmental regulation, and so it didn't go anywhere. What we heard from the government back was nothing happened. So I want to think about this relation. We know that pollution can be a form of colonialism. We know that pollution in Chemical Valley, going into Aamjiwnaang, concentrating in Aamjiwnaang First Nation, is a physical, material form of pollution. But I also want to say the way we've built a permission to pollute state that monitors chemical violence in a way to say nothing is happening here, that's also a kind of colonialism. I think of this as a kind of infrastructure of gaslighting. Gaslighting is not interpersonal. We build it into our science and our state. So here's an example. In Canada, we have this thing called the National Pollution Release Inventory. You have the same thing in the United States. It's called the TRI. And every facility in Canada, in the United States, has to report every year what its emissions are. Right? And there's a list of 300 pollutants on that list. And you can believe me that if that pollutant is on that list, that's because there's an abundance of research that there's a problem with that chemical. Like, that's the only way you're going to get it on that list. So they have to report every year what the substances are. So this is a little snapshot of them reporting all the substances that they emit. Well, we dug into this data, and what we found was that of that data, 87.5% were basically made up numbers. Only 5.4% were made using any kind of physical measure at the facility. 87.5% were made by just using an industry available equation on an Excel sheet that says, if you have a refinery and you made X number of barrels, use this number. And then we don't know about 7%. So these numbers are not good. They tell us there's pollution, but they also obscure. They give us the sense that the state is watching when it's not. We use this kind of data, though, to try to make claims about the relationship of facilities to, for example, indigenous communities, poor communities, black communities. And this is one of the ways we make claims to environmental racism. But the actual reporting about chemical violence is, I would say, a form of gaslighting. So I want to think about this as a kind of settler colonial gaslighting. So let's go back and think about terra nullius, right? The idea nothing's happening here. So it's not just that nothing's happening here when the land is being taken, but nothing is happening here when your body sovereignty is being disrupted. And we can think about this kind of work from the United States about racial gaslighting, thinking about how whiteness operates as well through a kind of gaslighting, where whiteness works often through denying, setting up a situation where people are able to deny it's at work in the space. So gaslighting, I think, is really important to understanding the ongoing work of race in settler colonial plantation. But because I'm a science kind of person, I also see gaslighting as being in the science of chemicals as well. Something like the dose-response curve. So everyone probably knows the idea of the dose-response curve, right? The more of the chemical, the worse the effect, right? The dose makes the poison. So then you design an experiment to look for the threshold, right, where that chemical starts to give a negative effect. And the idea is that for every chemical, there's like an amount that you can do and it's not a problem. We can pollute up to here before it's a problem. Right? So there's a whole bunch of things going on in this. One, there's a setup. The idea that we can pollute up to here before there's a problem. The second is the idea that the dose makes the poison. When it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, some of the strongest effects happen at the lowest doses. It actually has a monotonic curve. It has a high effect at a low curve, at a low dose, then it goes down again, and then it has another high and usually different effect at a high dose. So all those effects that we see that end up having sex ratio change, affecting the reproductive intergenerational life of turtles and fishes, are erased from this. Then we can look at the experimental design for figuring out what's wrong with chemicals. We study chemicals one by one. We report chemicals one by one. We put them in a box with a mouse. We expose that mouse for X amount of time and see what it does. Does it do something predictable, right, that we can then say and associate with that chemical? So this mouse in a box and experiment is a setup to make many kinds of erasures. You can erase what happens when you have multiple chemicals at once. You can erase low doses because it's not set up to measure low doses. You can erase chronic effects because you only expose the mouse for so long. So this is actually, there's all sorts of things you can do. The way you put the chemical into the chamber. Also, like you wouldn't believe the kinds of gamesmanship of like fiddling with the way by corporations to put the chemical in the chamber to get a certain kind of effect, right? So this becomes an area of gamesmanship in order to make experiments that don't show chemical effects. So that's gaslighting. The second habit I want to talk about is damage-based research. So I think I may be giving you a little sense of my frustration, right? So much research about chemical violence does not work. It does not show what we need to do. It does not show what's obvious to our senses. We don't need that science to see the flame ball at the refinery, right? But that monitor said nothing happened. It's so incredibly frustrating. So then what do you do? What do you do when that doesn't work? Well, you turn to damage-based research. That means you look to find the effects of violence in bodies and lands. You look to medical studies, you look to ecological studies, and you portray the way that lands and bodies are injured. Here, this kind of research, I think, has many problems. And here I want to think about calls from Indigenous communities to suspend damage-based research. To suspend research that's studying people's suffering. To refuse it. Why? Well, first of all, that kind of research represents the people who experience environmental violence the most as often in deficit. Think how the community of Flint is represented in the media. So people are represented as in deficit, as reduced to their damage, as not complex beings. And then we also know this truism, that damage begets damage. Where are you going to put that garbage? Are you going to put it here or where we see a bunch of garbage already? If you declare something as already wasted, already injured, already damaged, you open up a logic that sees it as a benefit to concentrate damage where it already is. So an alternate to damage-based research is desire-based research. Research oriented towards figuring out how communities adapt, survive, live, but also paying attention not trying to pin the representation of damage onto the people who bear the burden of that violence, but figuring out ways to look at violence and pinning the responsibility onto the perpetrators of that violence. So how to do that? So I think about suspending damage partially through this little creature. Do people know this one? You probably have it here. It's the round goby. The round goby helps me think through suspending damage and our understanding of chemical exposures. It's emerged, it's a little tiny fish. It's emerged as a particular sentinel of pathological life caused by endocrine disrupting chemicals on the Great Lakes. It's a fish from the Black and Caspian Sea that was first found right around Chemical Valley in 1990, likely brought there in the ballast water of cargo ships. Gobies are bottom feeders. In other words, they live off the layer of organisms and mussels at the bottom of the lake. And the term bottom feeder has a particular resonance, right? They're often called lowlifes. They're called illegals. They are seen as suspects, and mostly thought of in ecological management discourse as beings to be exterminated. You can see these kind of tropes of wanted, dead or alive from the quote Wild West, advertising the kind of need to exterminate the goby. Here is a favorite one from Ontario, beware the goby, like it's so gigantic. The goby's about this big. And it happens that the goby, what does it like to eat? It likes to eat zebra mussels, right? A very famous invasive species. And it turns out that zebra mussels are, because they're filter feeders, they bioconcentrate chemicals. And so the persistent chemicals in the Great Lakes from over 150 years of polluting then concentrate in the zebra mussels. The goby comes and eats them, and then they bioaccumulate up the food chain quicker now. Or that's the accusation. That's the crime of the round goby. The crime is that it's helping to resurrect these chemicals from the industrial past and not just letting them sit in the sediment. At the same time, the round goby is so successful as a species because it's pollution tolerant. You find it in the most contaminated and garbage-filled parts of the lake. It makes its nest in the garbage. So for mainstream ecologists, the goby is something to get rid of. It's an outsider, a pest, an uninvited racialized immigrant, a low-caste bottom dweller. It's a killable, unproductive life. In a way that kind of denies how disrupted and in the aftermath the Great Lakes already are. But for other scientists, the round goby has become the sentinel of chemical contamination for a different reason, and in a different way. It's because the goby shows signal sex changes in response to the endocrine disrupting chemicals of fossil fuel capitalism that are in the lake. Ecologists capture round gobies in sites expected to have high levels of contaminations and then perform a variety of tests on them that can't be done to human bodies. They dissect them, they look at their livers, their chemical loads, but in particular, they look at things like the change to their genitals. They look at their testes, where gobies form eggs in their testes when they're exposed to endocrine disrupting chemicals. And they also study what they call the expansion of goby genders that happens when they are developed in the context of highly contaminated sites. Thus, the round goby, who only lives for 2 or 3 years, has become the signature of contamination for the destruction or the pollution of the Great Lakes, a living assay of altered life that provides a way to map the presence of these endocrine disrupting chemicals in their sexed living being. And the really interesting thing about the round goby is it's a signature of contamination, but it's a survivor. It thrives nonetheless. Sex becomes in the round goby not the characteristics of a kind of body or a demonstration of its damage, but it's the goby's responsive potential within the antagonistic and complex chemistry of capitalism and colonialism. The goby thrives even in its embodied difference as it becomes more or less activated in its plasticity in response to these chemicals that can sometimes kill you, can be unbearable, but are also often survivable. So we have the fishes, we have the birds, we have the humans, we have the turtles, we have the mollusks, all in this responsivity, this metabolic responsivity to these chemicals. And the bellies now of the other fish, the snakes, the birds in the Great Lakes 30 years on are now filled with the tasty round goby. And if you go online, you can begin to see all sorts of round goby human recipes. So with the round goby, it's helpful for me to think that becoming altered with chemicals doesn't have to be only a damage-based research. We can help, the round goby helps me understand that we are unevenly sharing and entangled in the process of becoming with the chemicals that settler colonialism has helped to make, has helped to kind of coercively bring us together through. The round goby makes relations of thriving in damaged worlds. The round goby is messed up by settler colonialism, but like I am too. And I think probably you are as well. And that's not all we can or are. So the round goby helps me think about this idea that Vanessa Agard-Jones writes about, which is chemical kinship. How do chemicals create forms of kinship amongst us? Right? Not just between being both injured by a chemical, but also as people who benefit and injure one another in very uneven ways. So our chemical kinships can also be with what we might call bad relatives or bad kin, right? Not just across shared exposures. So then the question for me in thinking my way out of damage-based research becomes how to be in ethical relation in our chemical kinship, even including with our injurious kin, our kin like imperial oil, like Monsanto, who made almost all the world's PCBs. Everyone in this room has PCBs in them. And here I turn to paraphrasing Fred Moten and think, what kind of the idea of chemical kinship might do. And he says, the coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's messed up for you, in the same way that we've already recognized that it's messed up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this is killing you too, however more softly. So habit 3, the idea that chemicals are small and discrete. They're like molecules, one by one, right? When you think, I've written like so many reports and things where this is like how I've pictured the chemical, a structural diagram of its atoms. Like when you had to close your eyes and think, what is a molecule like? You'd probably raise something like this, right? How a set of atoms fit together. I've come to think of this as the chemical in white space. It's the chemical that denies all its relations, right? It's only willing to admit, the version of it is only willing to admit to its molecular and atomic relations. I want to argue that chemicals are not small. Chemicals are massive. We all have in each other probably about 100, at least 100 persistent chemicals that help to make our being. So what do we want to do in this research? We want to co-create alternative understandings of chemicals by and for fence-line communities and indigenous sovereignty. We want to confront gaslighting by corporate and state practice with obligations for violence. We want to refuse damage-based research and respect all relations, even our damaged and injured relations must be loved. Show that industrial chemicals are not small, they are extensive, they are infrastructural. We want to weigh down polluters with responsibilities, our bad kin. We want to create other forms of justice that do not rely on the nation state. The nation state's not doing a good job, and it certainly doesn't support indigenous sovereignty. So how do we do all this? Well, one of the inspirations is this work by the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, and their really important study called Violence on the Land is Violence on Our Bodies. And this is some artwork by Erin Marie Consmo, who's an amazing Métis feminist. And it was part of their action toolkit that came out when they launched this important report. And the idea, is you use it on social media, you put it up and you take a selfie. But what I think is really powerful about this is the way that it helps us understand how wrong it is to think of chemicals as small. When you're breathing in an industrial chemical, you're not breathing in a molecule. You might be breathing in a fracking pad. When you're breathing in an industrial molecule, you might be breathing in a pipeline. When you're breathing in a chemical in Chemical Valley, you're likely to be breathing in some of Imperial Oil's refinery. So when we think about chemicals as large and being an extensive relation, right, we're thinking about these infrastructures. But we're not just thinking about them as like abstract ways, like chemicals are connected to the places that produce them. What's really important, and this is to understand these relations aren't just connections. They're about obligations and responsibilities. So when we say we want chemicals to have relations, we mean we want to have relations that are about ethical obligation. We can think of these being to things like capitalism and colonialism and whiteness, but we can also think about these ethical obligations as being to our fish, to our ancestors, to those yet to come. So when we begin to study the way that a molecule shapes our biology, we are not just thinking about the molecule. We are thinking about that expansive chemical relation and all the obligations. We're thinking about that colonialism and all the obligations. And rather than having that really expansive version of the chemical and stick it, like you would in damage-based research, onto the people who suffer the most from that violence, we want to figure out ways to visualize how to stick it on to our injurious kin, how to stick it back onto the refinery or the pipeline. But But of course, it's not just the refinery. The corporations also have their own kinship. So Imperial Oil, by the end of the 19th century, was bought by this company, Standard Oil. Who knows what Standard Oil is called today? Exxon, exactly, ExxonMobil. So this is like one of the world's biggest oil companies, and I think the oldest. And they majority own that Imperial refinery. And we know that there's only about 100 of these companies responsible for 71% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we know, and one of the ways that we think about this in Canada is that Chemical Valley is part of a giga project. It's part of a massive continental-wide project in which companies are investing in each other in extraction, in refining, and in transport. So pipelines, refining, and extraction all together. In particular, Imperial Oil helped to give rise to this company, Enbridge. Have people here heard of Enbridge?
Yep.
So Enbridge is one of the biggest pipeline companies here in North America, and it has some of the longest pipelines in the world. And in fact, how it started was that Imperial Oil, that refinery, that Imperial Oil refinery, those oil fields that were close by started to dry up. And so they needed to bring oil from farther away down to Chemical Valley for processing. So Imperial Oil built that first pipeline out to what we now call the tar sands out in Alberta, right? And started building that continental pipeline. So Imperial Oil is owned by ExxonMobil. Imperial Oil then works with another company called Consumer Gas to build Enbridge. Consumer Gas, now this is where we're getting very Torontonian on this. Consumer Gas was owned by someone who's famous in Toronto, Mr. Austin. If you come as a tourist to Toronto, one of the things they kind of direct you to is like his fancy mansion. Mr. Austin was not only president of Consumer Gas, he was president of a bank called Dominion Bank. Dominion Bank became Toronto Dominion Bank. Toronto Dominion Bank is the 19th biggest bank in the world. It owns 1% of Imperial. Is the 7th biggest owner of Imperial, but more importantly is a serious trader when it comes to the financialization of extraction. So TD Bank, its headquarters is in downtown Toronto. Folks who maybe are interested in divestment might remember that TD Bank was an important target of divestment campaigns because it was one of the funders of the Dakota Access Pipeline, for example. And we can, just like we talk about those 100 oil corporations contributing to greenhouse gases, we can also point out the 33 biggest banks that create the financial capital for keeping fossil fuel capitalism going. And giving a shout out back to my hometown of Toronto, Toronto is the home of the Toronto Stock Exchange. The Toronto Stock Exchange is the biggest trader of extractive industry in the world. That's where it happens, is this place. And Toronto is the home and downtown to the most mining headquarters of any place in the world. So I want to be thinking when we breathe in that molecule, we're not just breathing in that relationship to Imperial Oil. We've got Exxon there. We've got TD Bank there. We've got finance capital. Right? We really want to be thinking about the obligations that go with chemicals. What does it mean then to think of that chemical pollution and bring that responsibility back to TD? What would that look like? So what I'm trying to get at is a vision of chemicals as land-body relations. And when I say that, you might think about land-body relations like that's something that happens like out in the bush, right? It's like something that happens out on the lake. As opposed to land-body relations is something that's happening everywhere. Like land-body relations are happening in this room. Land-body relations is happening at TD Bank. Land-body relations is happening in Chemical Valley, right? They're just not happening through ethical relationality, right? They're happening violently. So when we see something like police pushing land protectors aside to get a pipeline through, we're seeing, I think, also chemicals as land-body relations. And I want to leave you with this, the dish with one spoon wampum covenant. So there's many ways, I think, to rethink chemicals. when we refuse something like the version of the chemical that settler colonialism gives us and think, what comes next? We might think we have to be inventing a bunch of new things. But one of the things that I've really come to feel is that so much of what we already need to address environmental violence is already here. We already have it. We actually already know what to do. The 19th century wasn't that long ago. There are trees around where I live that can remember before settler colonialism arrived, right? Fossil fuel capitalism only started in 1850, right? We can remember it not being here. So one of the things that we really take seriously in the lab about activating in terms of another way of doing relation is this, the Disheth-Wansum Wampum Covenant. This is a treaty between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Confederacy about how to live on the lower Great Lakes. And do people here know about this treaty? So in all our land acknowledgements in Toronto, we pretty well call out to this treaty. And this treaty is based on the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace. And the idea is that purple circle in the middle is like a bowl, right? And imagine you're out at a dinner and you're passing around a bowl and you would be so rude to just put it all on your plate and leave nothing for the next person, right? So the bowl is like the basin of the Great Lakes. And the agreement is to live on the land peacefully in such a way that you don't take more than you need, and you must leave for others and those yet to come. And it's called the Disheth-One-Spoon Wampum Treaty because the idea of the spoon is that there will be no knives, that we're not going to resolve our disagreements with violence. We're going to find other ways to be in ethical relation. And this treaty is over 400 years old. And it looks nothing like those charter agreements that I showed you at the beginning, right? And if you look at it, how the leather extends out to the side, that means that they go on forever. There's not an end to them. And if you think about this treaty, each of these are beads made from quahog shells. And you think of the time that went into making each of those beads. Think of the conversation that went into making each of those beads, the sociality. Think about making the whole belt. Think about the feasting, the days of feasting and discussion that had to happen in order to make this treaty. Think about then 400 years of polishing the treaty, right, to take care of it. That's a really different vision of ethical relation. What happens if we would bring this to our understanding of what we're doing with chemicals? So this is downtown Toronto. This is a piece of art by the Anishinaabe group, Ogama Mekana. And it says in Anishinaabe-Moan, we see the one dish with one spoon belt. And it says in Anishinaabe-Moan, if you're going to learn something, you must start with this. So we already have instruction where to start. Thank you. Hope someone has a question. Didn't put everyone to sleep.
Excellent questions. Just lying back here.
Thank you. That was really wonderful. I was wondering if you knew that there's if you knew that the passageway underneath the Lake Superior up to Duluth, there's under the lake pipeline. Is that Enbridge as well?
Line 5? I think
It's had all kinds of
Enbridge.
problems, but if it was catastrophic, it would
Yeah.
end.
And there's
Lake
one
Superior.
under the St. Clair River that's 100 years old. Kind of amazing.
Just quickly, I was wondering if you could talk more about the expansive chemical relations image that you put up there. Was wondering how you created it.
Yeah. Okay. So how I created it was, it's a speculative data visualization. So one of the things that we're working towards in our lab, and this is what I'm going to be talking about on Friday, is the actual data visualization work. So, on what? On Thursday?
It's okay.
At another talk here is the actual data visualization. We're working to try to take all that we're saying and make data visualizations for Aamjiwnaang about what Imperial Oil is doing. So this was a kind of speculative visualization to try to just mess up your idea of get out of the atomic molecule and get into expansivities. And so I just put in things that I think really shape what chemicals are in their expansivities, but then also recognizing the knowns and the unknowns that are part of chemical relations. It's not that we can have total fulsome knowledge and get to the completeness of the chemical relation, right? Chemicals still do a lot of widely things that we don't know. For example, we don't know when we get sick which exposure caused it, right? There's usually a lag between our suffering and our exposure. So there's a built-in level of unknowing that's part of our chemical relations that make calling out perpetrators sometimes difficult. I don't have them here, but we're building an actual visualization, actual app that will you can use on Imperial Oil and then hopefully use on any facility in Canada, which will pull up the chemical relations for that.
Hi. So I have been studying toxicology and sort of like industrial toxicology for most of my master's. And
As a toxicologist?
kind of. Long story. But essentially, here in Wisconsin, there's actually, can you hear me? Here in Wisconsin, there is a really strong liability statute, which requires the owner of any property to remediate. And essentially, I guess the way that that is working out for soil toxicology is that vacant lots, brownfields, whatever, are not being properly remediated, or they aren't like well understood.
Do they have to put money in advance to prepare for the remediation?
No. So there's a lot of like vacated properties because of also like the result of industrialization on the economics and, graphic side of things. So city-owned properties cannot be tested if you want to garden or grow. Also, it's not advisable to test your soil because you will have to remediate it. So when it comes to diffuse contamination, which is, for everybody who doesn't know, essentially that are disseminated air, can you envision a better
I'll tell you what I kind of come to in the context of Canada, which is, maybe there's some different situations here in Wisconsin. But in the context of Canada, there's almost even no place to report pollution. Like there's no one to receive the complaint of the spill or the event. Like it's really not designed to regulate pollution. And I compare this to things like in Canada, it's almost what we've seen in recent years. It's really difficult to convict a white person of killing an Indigenous person. We can't get juries to do that. And we can't get police departments to investigate the case of murdered Indigenous people in a way that could be brought to court in a meaningful way. And we see that the federal government says we're going to start doing UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, and do informed consent with Indigenous communities for pipelines, but then it doesn't. So I've really come to the point of feeling like, at least in the context of Canada and in Ontario, the state cannot be turned to for justice. And the legal system is not going to give any justice. And so one of the questions then is, what is justice then? What is justice if we can't find it in the institutions, which we can also say have their history in settler colonialism? And there's the question of, this is partially also why I'm talking about ethical relation and attaching responsibilities to perpetrators. So if the nation state is not going to regulate polluters, right? How can we create attachments of justice, calls to justice? They might be enfeebled in a certain ways, but calls to divestment, calls to responsibility for TD Bank or Imperial Oil that might affect, for example, its risk profile and its site as an attractive investment. Finance capital. Can we affect the sense that this is violence that doesn't count as violence? We want to create a kind of way of doing justice that's saying this violence counts as violence, even though the settler state refuses it. And so this is like a big question. And of course, there's Indigenous law. Indigenous jurisdiction is one of the greatest things we've got going to defend land right now in North America. But I feel very pessimistic about policy on that kind of level. I have tried to write policy documents. I've gotten a little bit of traction around endocrine disrupting chemicals, but you can imagine the resistance to want to attend to low-level doses of chemicals as being harmful. Low-level doses of chemicals as having epigenetic effects that could actually be inherited across generations. Do you think the state is interested in that? Like, no, they're really not. You can only get it so far, right, in there. So this is kind of where I've come to, and I think it's also why I call this like a decolonial project, which is, what does it mean to create forms of justice that aren't calling the state down on us as the place where we're going to get justice? Maybe we have to make other ways of being in governance together without the state. That's probably not the answer that you wanted to hear, but thank you for the question.
Hello. Okay, so thank you for the talk. I really appreciate it. It was kind of a roller coaster for me because there are things that I thought it sounds really weird, but then I really liked the ending, especially. But I would like to ask about the universal prospects of what you were talking about here, particularly in the section where you talked about the privatization of the lands that were previously belonging to the indigenous populations. It sounds really familiar from European history, not necessarily colonial situations, where especially the British elites will make these enclosures and just throw away all the villagers who previously had a feudal property, including communal lands where they can graze their cattle and all that. So, and eventually, of course, those peasants will end up in slums in Liverpool and die of typhus, probably. So I would like to comment about this more universal aspects of capitalism and class violence, which seems to me more prevalent especially considering that in the 19th century, class was even racialized in Europe?
Well, okay, where to start with that? I'm really not inclined to a universal or globalized account of environmental violence. So whether it's saying global capital, whether it's saying the Anthropocene, that we might have planetary scaled measures. This is why I talked about the specificity of settler colonial plantation. And I want to unpack some of why I feel like this. One is that colonialism partly worked by saying there's only one world. There's only one set of epistemologies that make sense. There's only one science. There's only one God. There's only one truth. And other forms of knowledge don't count. Right? Not only do those other forms of knowledge don't count, but those worlds might be materially destroyed. Those people eliminated, taken off land, dispossessed, and so on. So colonialism worked partially through a vision of a universal world, a God for the whole planet. And we see this in science, the idea that there could be a universal truth. And I just don't subscribe to that. I believe that, and this really is learning from a lot of Latin American decolonial thinking, that this is a world of many worlds. That there are many worlds here in this world. And so, for example, even the way we cut things up between humans and not humans, or alive and dead, right? In Anishinaabe thought, the divisions between alive and dead are not at all like how we do alive and dead in Western science, right? A stone is a grandfather. And so this way of kind of domaining the world, there are many worlds here. And these other ways of domaining the world often or can have ways of extending personhood beyond what we call the human, right? So fish can be people. Fish can have nations. Buffalo are people, and they have nations. And so these other worlds have been, to a large extent, eliminated, or there's been an attempt to eliminate and break them, but they're still here and persistent. And so this is why I don't want an explanation of environmental violence that's like there's one world and one main explanation and one main thing. I want to say there's many worlds here. Some of these worlds know how to be here differently without doing this violence. So I guess I don't believe in the total subsumption of capitalism. I feel like capital gives us a vision of the world totally subsumed by itself. That's the imagination it wants us to have, right? Of the world fully subsumed. And when I talk about to be against damage research, and we are not just our damage, that's related to that, right? I don't believe we are just fully subsumed. We are more than that. And there's other ways of recognizing and being with that. So that's why I'm not inclined to that globalized explanation, if you will. It's kind of a big reason why. That's not to say that worlds aren't totally connected. That ExxonMobil isn't a darn big multinational. That worlds and sites aren't materially doing things to one another, aren't disrupting and shaping and interacting and reformulating one each other. They're not like distinct spheres that don't touch. So, of course, we need transnational. We need to have a sense of that really big scale of change, that really deep time. But I think we also have to start here. And when we start here, the other side to it is, if you posit the problem as planetary. What are you going to end up with? The military doing a geoengineering project in the atmosphere or something. You know, how are we going to get the planetary solution to the planetary Anthropocene? Right? That's like a call for an imperial project. So if we start here, right, then I also believe it's a theory of change. It's not like there's only one theory of change, but this is one of them, right? That we can begin to make decolonial potentials like here, like right now, like in this space, in this particularity with this land. And that can maybe get us somewhere. And maybe that gets us somewhere that's like like partly pessimistic. It's like gonna get us like through the ongoing aftermath of it all, right? But I think that to me is where my sights are, right? In terms of the level of scale of a theory of change that then is related to why I wouldn't want to go that big.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was really lovely. At some point during the talk, you mentioned rethinking land as more than resource. And throughout the talk, I feel like I heard sort of whispers of different kinds of theory, like a mix of post-colonial theory and maybe affect theory, and thinking through relation or having intensities, you know, as part of that list of the wider chemical relations. So my question is sort of if you can talk a little bit more about that, about the theory that sort of underlays this research, and maybe in particular in relation to the way that land can be thought of as a body or something more than resource.
So thank you for asking that question. So the way I think about land in this work, and why I usually capitalize it, capital L land, is because I'm really trying to be responsible to an Anishinaabe understanding of land. So Anishinaabe Aki, where land is not just like dirt, or it's not like territory. Land is a set of relations in a place. And these relations are material. They also can be spiritual. They can be very temporally extensive. So like in Haudenosaunee, for example, and a wonderful book on this is The Clay Beneath Our Feet by my colleague Susan Hill. Where do you see the future? Where do you see future generations? It's in the soil. When you look at the soil, you see the faces of the future, right? That's because you are land. You are part of land. Land comes through you. So we think about often in like science, like reproduction happens like a body to a body, right? Understanding our reproductive relation to land, right? Where we're made out of land. Land makes us. The future yet to come is in that land, right? And that land is not just soil, it's full of relations, includes the beings, etc. Also, like if we can talk about water, like the word for water is nebe, and that means like toward yourself. So like even that is like water. It's not water, it's like a thing. It's like the gesture of toward yourself. It is like it's the thing that makes all. And so understanding like that version of land is a really different version of land, right? And so then you can begin to think, if that land is the future generations, then what are your obligations, right, to that land? If you are made out of that land, what is that? And then how can then you just be that land even when you've been displaced, right? You somehow carry that land. You are already land. Right? So that's the theory of land. It's not even a theory, the teaching of land, the being of land, talking about land being in other ways. And then in terms of like thinking about intensity, the reason why I mention intensity is not so much affect theory, but like in emphasizing chemical kinship, I think it's sometimes there's a temptation to like, okay, yes, we all are who we are because in part we have been exposed. But its intensity is not even, right? That exposure kills some communities, right? So intensity that's why I'm thinking about intensity, because of the profound unevenness of violence, the profound unevenness of hostility, and also the profound unevenness of relation. You know, you think all our relation, we're all just connected, is not like so easy like that. It's very uneven. So that's why I think about intensities. And then in terms of like post-colonial thought, you know, I would call like my previous work was much more engaged with post-colonial theory, and particularly this question we might say of like being in the aftermath of colonialism. But an important case, and like, you know, we probably, you know, people in here have read the classic Patrick Wolf essay on settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, right? So when we understand settler colonialism as a structure, that means it's infrastructurally extensive, its presence in the architecture, in the infrastructures, in the laws, etc. But it's also extensive in time. It goes back, it goes forward. Right? And so that's in antagonism with often post-colonial understandings of the timescape of colonialism. But we don't need to in this work, we don't need to find commensurability. This is like really important, and I feel like Fanon is really helpful for this. Like an important part of understanding how colonialism works and settler colonialism works is it sets up unresolvable incommensurabilities that we are living in. And we can't smooth them over and fix them with our like theory. We have to like deal with them. So I don't know, that's some of the theory that's there.